Let's do this. The Cult of Hockey podcast by the faithful and for the faithful. I'm David Staples of the Edmonton Journal. And I'm here today with Bruce McCurdy. Hey, Bruce.
Hey David, how you doing today?
Good, Bruce. How are you doing?
Oh, well enough for a hot week. Somehow survived the week. Did all my walking in the morning this week to avoid the searing mid to high 30s temperatures in the late afternoon and evening hours. And made
It's a
it this
nice day.
far.
Nice day yesterday and
hmm Yeah, it's pleasant enough
beautiful
actually
day
today.
today. Alrighty, we're talking today about something that the Oilogosphere, that used to be called, not so much anymore, you don't hear that word anymore, Oiler fans on the internet are talking about at length the proposed deal for Duncan Keith, something that no one had been thinking about until 2 days ago. Elliot Friedman spread the rumor that Keith may be looking for a move to Western Canada. Elliot Friedman fleshed that out. Essentially, the story is for personal reasons. Keith wants a trade to a city which is a quick plane ride away from Penticton, where his ex-wife and child live. He wants better access to that than he had in Chicago. And so he's looking for a trade to Western Canada. We've since heard that probably Vancouver and Calgary are out as
hmm
possible destinations, that Winnipeg isn't likely either. I don't know, maybe there's not the flights from Winnipeg to Penticton, probably isn't a direct flight, but that Edmonton and Seattle are still in the mix. So Friedman and Bob Stauffer were talking about this deal on Bob's show on Oilers Now on Friday. They had a lengthy discussion. And Friedman spelled out the parameters for both teams. That the Oilers feel they're in an advantageous salary cap position right now, and they don't want to lose that in this trade, which means essentially they don't want to take on the full cost of Duncan Keith's $5.5 million contract, which has 2 years running. He's 38 years old. When you look at the buyout calculator from for Chicago, it seems to be one of these really poison pill contracts to buy out. It's almost like very little relief from buying Keith
Right.
out. Chicago, on the other hand, has that same goal of not wanting to take on salary, because they're looking at bringing in Seth Jones, and they seem to think, the suggestion is, there's whispers according to Friedman, that they're looking at Caleb Jones, because if they get Caleb Jones, then maybe Seth Jones would want to go to Chicago more. And to the extent that Seth Jones calls the shot on his own trade, I don't know to what extent that is, but he does, I think, because it makes sense, because he has 1 year left on his deal. If he's going to go to a city, Columbus maximizes its value if Seth Jones agrees to sign a contract in that new city. In theory, he's more likely to do that if his brother Caleb is there. So there's that makes a bit of sense. There's also the fact that the Oilers are likely to lose either Caleb Jones or William Lagesson in the expansion draft to Seattle. So they're free to move either of them. That would mean, though, that they would lose both of them rather than just being down one kind of somewhat, your mileage varies, promising defenseman on the left side. They would lose both most likely this offseason and get Duncan Keith back in return. Of course, Oilers are well stocked on the left side with prospects, so that doesn't alarm some people, but it really alarms others who place a high value in Caleb Jones.
Yeah.
So all of these things are going on at once. But the big question is, what is Duncan Keith's value right now as a hockey player? And the other question is, based on that, what should the Oilers be looking to do in this deal in terms of making Chicago take on a bad contract in return, to the extent that Keith has negative value, or retain salary? So those are the big issues. And I'm going to start out by saying, Bruce, that my stance on all of these trades is that unless I've seen a player closely, unless I've watched him play 20,
hmm
30 games really closely, I am I'm aware there can be red flags based on statistics and based on what people are saying, but that's as far as I'll go. I'm very careful about trying to determine a player's value based on limited viewings or on stats, publicly available stats, which I don't feel are the kind of detailed analytics you really need to really properly assess a player. And I would hope that the Oilers have both things that I'm lacking in assessing Duncan Keith. Any NHL team that's doing its job has both up to the minute uh, a scout or scouts who watched every minute of Duncan Keith's play and is now going over that videotape again right now
Mm-hmm.
and assessing Keith's play based on what they're seeing, taking careful notes. And then they're comparing what they see in Keith's play to detailed uh, analytics that hone in on the individual tendencies of that player. You know, how many grade A scoring chances does he help create? How many did he give up last year? What is he like when it comes to zone exits? What is he like when it comes to puck retrievals? What is it like when it comes to zone entries?
Mm-hmm.
So my position on the Oilers is, and I can't answer this, if they aren't going on up-to-date scouting information, if they're just going to some past vision of Duncan Keith dancing in someone's head from 5 years ago, that is a colossal mistake if they do that. And I only
Mm-hmm.
raise that because I fear that that mistake was made with Kyle Turris. So I think that's a fair thing to raise in terms of the Edmonton Oilers right now. The other thing, the analytics side, I also have doubts with the Oilers. If they're going on ice, publicly available on ice statistics, which a lot of fans are on the internet, to me that's a terrible mistake. Like you're making a big mistake doing that. You need to have a strong analytics department that's boring into the individual acts of hockey players, or subscribe to one. And again, I don't know if the Oilers do either. So I'm filled with doubt about the Edmonton Oilers process. And also, I'm in face of the certainty that I see on the internet about Duncan Keith's value. I don't know how anyone can have that certainty unless they have that information themselves. And I don't think many people have that information who are weighing in with certainty about Duncan Keith right now. So I'm going to try to not weigh in with certainty myself, even though I do have a somewhat of an opinion that's probably not very useful about his value. So all that said, what is your opinion on this whole matter, Bruce?
Well, I mean, Duncan Keith, he signed a 13-year contract with Chicago back in 2010 after he'd been one of the key players, one of the core players to lead them to their first Stanley Cup title that spring. He signed a 13-year, $72 million pact with a no movement clause, heavily front loaded, so they don't owe him that much money. That's why the buyout terms are poor, because he's only got 2.1 and 1.5 million dollars left coming to him for his last 2 years at 5.5. The heck is that number? 5.538462 million dollars, which of course this cap hit spread out throughout. So this is literally the tail of the 13-year contract. Remember, there's a lot of talk about the tails of these long contracts that various people were getting, and so he's probably more of the value of the base salary, 2.1 this year, 1.5 next year, than he's anywhere close to being a $5.5 million defense. I mean, that's the same money that Darnell Nurse is making right now. Who would you rather have? Be paying 5.6 million to? I mean, obviously they would have both, but does he? It just doesn't make sense at that money. And
What's your best guess, Bruce? What would he make? Like if he was a free agent right now, let's say the Chicago Blackhawks
mhm.
had to buy, like decided to buy him out for some reason, and he was a UFA. Based on everything that you're hearing and assessing, and what do you think would be the range? Give me like within a $500,000 on a 1 year deal. What do you think? Or no, let's because he is signed for 2 years, two
Yeah.
year deal. What do you think he would get on a 2 year deal at this age right now? If and he was the complicating factor is that he's only willing to go to a couple cities, so
Right.
that greatly limits his value. But let's say
Right.
let's just say he was willing to go to any city, and the highest bidder would get him. What do you think he would get on a 2 year
Uh,
deal?
I think you probably get less than $3.6 million, which is what the amount that's left owing to him on the 2 years. But he's still got that huge heavy cap hit that's got to be taken out. Like
Is
he's
that
only got
3.6 million a year or 3.6 million in
2.1
total?
this year, 1.5 next year. So whoever is acquiring him is going to save a ton of real money against the cap, because they're going to have $11 million worth of cap and only three and change worth of actual pay for the guy. So, I mean, that's not Daryl Cates's usual style. Usually he goes the other way where he eats extra salary. So they're getting, the, the, the tail of the serpent, really. I mean, this is a player who's lost a lot of his edge over the years. I mean, a fantastic player. Don't get me wrong. He's had a great career. I think he's likely going to go into the Hockey Hall of Fame when he's done. Um,
Oh, for
but
sure.
he's turning 38 years old, and I'm just looking at the page now on Puck IQ showing his performance against uh, uh, in the over the last 7 years. Against how much time does he play against the elite opponents of the other team, and what percentage of the danger shots are taken when he's on the ice? So, granted, this is on ice, and he's 1 of 5. But last year, 2021, was by far his worst results for dangerous shot attempts, and by far the weakest opposition that he's played. Both things, like it's at the lower left of this chart that I'm looking at, and it's not the place you want to be. It's a sign of decline in a player, quite frankly, when you see him falling off the lower left of this particular graft.
What do you think he would get then on a contract, like free
I
market?
think I think his name would bring in some. I think he'd get $1.5 million, maybe. I mean, he's got some good experience. He's got some items working in his favor, but that cap hit is definitely not one of those things. I mean, he's up where Andrew Sekera's cap was, for instance, right? I mean,
Okay. So going on that, Bruce, if let's say he's $1.5 million, let's say he gets as high as 2 million. Let's say it
hmm
gets for some reason for over 2 years, because let's
hmm
just say he would still be, if the Chicago was to retain half of his salary,
yep,
that would be 2.75 or whatever,
almost 2.8. Yeah,
2.7, yeah, that's okay, 2.8 million. Okay. Uh, that's still not, he'd still be overpaid then, based, and I think that 1.5 to 2 million over a 2-year deal, I think he could probably get that. I wouldn't be surprised if, I mean, Kyle Turris got a 1.65 million. And Duncan Keith, I've been reading what people in Chicago said about him this season before this all came up, so that it's not clouded by anything. They were all
right.
expecting him back. They had all watched a full year of him. They had seen him play every game this year, which is hardly anyone commenting right now in Edmonton Oilers country on Duncan Keith saw him play even a handful of games last
I
year.
sure didn't.
Exactly. Who
This is
did?
this is a
So,
player I know well, David. I had him in my keeper league for many years, and I tracked him closely. But last year, I did not see much of any of the American teams, frankly, let alone Chicago Blackhawks, who are a pretty run-of-the-mill, rarely televised team.
and what we know about players of that age is their performance can fall off fast.
Yep.
So doesn't all, and I'm not saying that happened to Duncan Keith. Again, my position is I'm uncertain on these things. What? So anyway, I can't remember the point I was going to make now. Um, where was I going with this? It'll come to mind in a second. Bruce, what I would say about is the one statistic that does bother me a little bit is this. Um, Duncan Keith has been a point producer throughout his NHL career. And I actually think that points are a
hmm
pretty good proxy for offensive production, even like for defensemen. The
Right.
defensemen who tend to be good puck movers, solid puck movers, tend to put up the most points. And I don't think there's in any hockey camp, like any group of hockey fans, there's wide disagreement about that. There is an acknowledgement that in a single season you can be misled by point production, that there could be some bad puck luck or good puck luck with a particular player. So with Duncan Keith, I'm going to go over 2 years and look at his performance over 2 years
Right.
in terms of point production at even strength. So when we do that, Bruce, what we see out of 255 regular NHL D-men who played 200 even strength minutes per season. He ranks, out of 255, he ranks 171st for even strength point scoring the last 2 years. 0.69 points per 60. Slater Kukuk by the same stats. So Keith is at 171st. Kukuk's at 138th. Chris Russell,
Chris
he is
Russell.
at 150th. He is 21 points higher than is Duncan Keith.
So Keith is below the crusty line. Eh? It's like the
He's below the crusty line.
Mendoza line.
Let that sink in. Let that sink in. So Bruce, that's over 2 years.
Hmm.
And I think if you go over 2 years, and this is so if, when you go over 2 years, that's actually in Keith's favor because let's say he had bad puck luck this year. Well, over 2 years, it's a little less likely, but it's still not very good over 2 years, Bruce.
No.
And it's still really low. So what we see right now is a D-man who produces points at a kind of a third level pairing over the last 2 years. So to me, I'm gonna take that as it's not definitive. It doesn't define the player, but it says to me, yikes, he's not. He's probably right now a third pairing, maybe second pairing level defenseman if you stretch it in terms of his puck moving. And as for his defensive play, I'm not going to venture at all to say anything about his defensive play. But that he was known as a puck mover. He's known as a skater.
Oh, sure.
Uh, and for that to decline like that, so I'm gonna say his real value. I like your 1.5 because he's an
Hmm.
experienced player.
Yeah.
So in terms of ranking him, he has played tough competition, which really hammers players' stats. He's
But
been
not last
playing
year. He didn't. Not
not as
by
much
the
last
measure.
year. Okay, so he generally has in the last I think the year before he did. Anyway, he might do better if he was playing softer competition, I
Mhm.
guess is my point. So I,
Right.
I'm going to place his value at between 1.5 $2 million. So to me, if Chicago's saying, and this is where Stauffer and Friedman are, they are, there's some disagreement. Bob was coming out really strong that no, the Oilers are not going to be able to move James Neal's contract for James Neal and his contract for Duncan Keith. That's not on the table. It's going to be something more like Kyle Turris. They can move that contract, which is of very little value to the Oilers. They say if they
500
move
grand.
Kyle, yeah, the difference between sending Kyle Turris to the minors and keeping him is 500 grand on the cap. It's very
Yeah.
small amount. It doesn't make up for Duncan Keith earning
Nothing
five and a
close.
half, and it's for
Nothing
1 year.
close.
It's nothing
Yeah.
close. So if that's the idea, that's just a terrible idea. They've
Hmm.
got to get Chicago to retain half of Keith's salary or something close, and maybe then, like if they were to take on, let's say Mikko Koskinen and retaining half, 40%, you're getting closer. I mean, obviously, trading James Neal for Duncan Keith straight up, that's a good
Hmm.
trade for the Oilers. That's something
Oh,
that
sure.
they should.
I do that in a minute. In Chicago, if it's all about the cap, I mean, they'll complain about it, but at least the Neil contract, they can buy out and have real cap savings as opposed to the Keith contract, which is, as you say, a poison pill. It's the whole advantage that the Oilers got in obtaining Neil was that they got rid of another one of these, unbuyoutable contracts, which Keith basically appears to be. That Chicago, instead of having to, buying out Keith isn't an option, so they're either stuck with 5.5 million on their books for 2 years, or they could trade him for Neil and buy Neil out, and now they're on for 1.9 million for 4 years. But they're making big savings on the cap. I don't think Chicago would do that. Like I don't think there's enough in it for them. I was just saying, strictly from a financial perspective, they would come out ahead unless they had serious plans for Duncan Keith, which it doesn't sound like they do.
We don't know really how much Chicago needs to trade this player, right?
Yeah,
How much sway does a play like Duncan Keith? He's a talisman in Chicago.
yeah.
He's you know he, he's he's a sporting god there in Chicago. So if he wants out,
Hmm.
do they have to do that? And I think they might, right? I think if he was unhappy and not wanting to be there, that could be a big problem for the Chicago franchise.
Sure.
So if he really was, so I just think Seattle may have more impetus for taking him. Honestly, they have more ability in terms of the cap to do it than the Oilers do, and maybe that veteran leadership would really appeal to them as well. Now, what we hear from Seattle is their main thing this year is to maintain cap flexibility, though.
Hmm.
They're not interested in taking on a lot of bad contracts without getting major league paid for it.
Right.
So, in Chicago, one of the fans was suggesting this is someone who'd seen Duncan Keith all year long, right? So he
Right.
he, he has some knowledge of Duncan Keith that we lack, and he was suggesting that a fair return for Keith would be from the Oilers. Edmonton would have to give up a second round pick in 2022 and a fourth round pick in 2021. Now that could be like a hometown fan dreaming of a unrealistic return, but like Bob Stauffer mentioned that Chicago was looking for picks and prospects for Duncan Keith. I just think that is so far beyond the
It's
realm
ridiculous.
of
His
sanity. Yeah.
contract is a liability. So to think that you're supposed to trade off this boat anchor of a contract with 2 years of big cap on it for a declining elderly statesman of the game and somehow get a bunch of assets back for that is nuts.
So
Like
what is your
if
argument?
the Oilers do that, I am going to be seriously choked.
What is your argument that he's a boat anchor, Bruce? Like, what is your
Well, the
strongest argument
contract
for
is a
saying that
boat anchor. That term
compared
for
to
me is
performance?
about the
So
contract.
what is your anchor in terms of because if he was still a really good player, so what's your
Yeah,
arguments in
yeah.
terms of performance? What are
Well,
the things that make you convince you most of all that he's way below the 5 million? Because for me, it's his point production that really is the red
mhm,
flag for me. What is it for you?
right. Well, point production's part of it, but that those the possession numbers, the dangerous Fenwick that I cited earlier, dangerous shot percentage, and the percentage of time playing against elite competition. Like he moved down a class in terms of who he was playing against, and still he bled shots and goals against. Like he was a big minus player last year, which he isn't normally. There's just too many warning signs. And when you and I are comparing him to Chris Russell, and for years, I mean, we're among his bigger defenders in these parts. For years, we've been saying, "Damn it, that Chris Russell contract, $4 million for that guy," and we're paying him for, And they finally whittle him down to $1.25 million, and then turn around and bring on Duncan Keith and pay him 5.5. How are you even coming out ahead? Like, how is that using the cap space that they're finally getting, in part because of, marking down people like Chris Russell to more appropriate levels? Why turn around and then spend it on that? I mean, there would have to be very significant cap retention, and I'd like to think any sweeteners in the trade would be coming Edmonton's way, as opposed to Edmonton giving up picks and prospects for. I mean, if Ken Holland falls for falls for that, I'll be very disappointed.
Yeah, I agree. Player that age, that kind of drop in point production, that should be to me like that's a strong red. That's a big red flag. I'm gonna make
Mm-hmm.
just, and I'm not gonna say I believe this argument. Let's just pretend
Right.
that the Oilers
Okay.
traded for him and it worked
Mm-hmm.
out.
Yeah.
Why did it work out? So what we could say is, well, he's still been used. His usage is still as a top pairing defenseman. He had the most minutes of any Chicago player in key situations last year. Most time on ice shorthanded. Most time on ice for a defenseman. Most time on ice used in overtime. Most time on ice used on the power play. He was a weak power play point producer.
Yeah.
Uh, but his coach at least believed, of all the players, defensemen he had, which probably isn't saying a lot in Chicago right now, that Duncan Keith was still the best option to go in all these situations. I mean, we have seen other top defensemen hang on for a long time, especially if their skating is strong. Chris Chelios is a sometimes used as a comparable here. And here's what I would say about, like, if you're basing it a lot on the on ice numbers. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when Slater Kukuk and Dmitry Kulikov came to town, and the analytics community here was really excited about both these players because of their on ice
Mm-hmm.
numbers. I don't think they have that same excitement. Having seen these
Yeah.
players,
No,
that same excitement isn't there. So I'm going to say maybe they should think about the predictive value of those on ice numbers. If Kulikov and Kukuk didn't perform as they thought when they got to Edmonton, maybe take a step back and think maybe this isn't definitive, and maybe I shouldn't be certain that this is going to tell me how Duncan Keith's going to perform, because it's certain. And I actually was skeptical of Cuckoo, and I was pleasantly surprised. I would prefer that they just stick with Slater Cuckoo probably over Duncan Keith. I think he's probably a better player at this point.
certainly
Uh,
cheaper.
he's a lot, well, especially based on salary. Kulikov, I've seen enough. Like I just didn't see a player that at least Cuckoo is not being mentioned as in the top four, and I don't think Kulikov is a top four
Right.
defenseman in the NHL. So I'd like to see them move on. So my point is on ice numbers. I just find it's experiences like this where I see such excitement about players like Cuckoo and Kulikov, and then they are what they are. And so here there's this huge, he's going to be terrible. Maybe he won't be. Like, I'm not sure that you're telling me that. And I would need personally, if I was making that decision, I just would need a ton more information
Mm-hmm.
than those numbers. I would need real. And so, do the Oilers have that, Bruce? What do you, like? I'm skeptical of it. What about you? What's your feeling?
Well, I am skeptical based on their past record of recent performance. The guys that they brought in, from the pro ranks, and how quickly they fell off a cliff. I mean, Kyle Turris being the obvious example, but I mean, James Neal, David, he never turned it around really in Edmonton for more than a few weeks at the start of his first season here. And you can go back to, back over the years. And so here you're saying what would be, let's say they made the trade and it worked out, what would be the reason? Well, here's my reason. They brought in Duncan Keith, and they welded him to the left side of Evan Bouchard. And they said, okay, you two, you're going to be a pairing all year. You're going to be our 2A or 2B pairing, along with the Adam Larson pairing. And we're going to run with Darnell Nurse in number 1, and then we're going to go with the 2A and 2B. And you guys are going to play a lot, but we're going to pick your spots for you. And Duncan, you're going to teach old man Bouchard here everything you know about winning Stanley Cups while playing defense. And Evan, you're going to listen and learn. And it's going to, be a relationship that works. I'm not saying that's going to happen. I'm just saying if it worked, that might be a reason they actually found a perfect situation for him to mentor and help to improve a young player. Now, that said, one of the big advantages of Evan Bouchard for the next 2 years is he's on the ELC and he's not getting paid, but to overpay his partner kind of defeats the advantage.
So would you have Larson with Nurse in this scenario, or Bear with Nurse?
Probably Bear with Nurse and Larson on the sort of defensive
shutdown pairing.
Yeah.
You'd have to bring in another player. What about Keith and Larson?
Still got to find left defensemen, don't they?
Yeah. What about Keith and Larson?
It's possible. It's certainly possible. I mean, Keith is certainly a veteran player that's seen a lot of different scenarios. He played with Brent Seabrook for a lot of years, and they're Larson and Seabrook aren't identical twins, but they do have things in common in terms of their style of play. I guess my bigger concern in all this is, does Ken Holland overvalue Duncan Keith and sort of, oh boy, we can get, this legacy player out of Chicago, and the guy's 38 years old. And Oilers, I mean, this is a case where he has to be patient. Chicago is kind of painted into a corner. The guy's asked for a move, and he's given them a very limited set of destinations. Why should Edmonton be falling over sideways, trying to bring him on when they can maybe get the pot sweetened a little bit by holding firm? And certainly, I hope that's what Ken Holland's doing. And but what I can tell you for sure is Ken Holland has a long history of bringing on very veteran defensemen, typically at the trade deadline, which would make this one different. But here's a list of guys he traded for over the years. Jamie McCowan, when he was 36 years old. Dmitry Mironov, 32. Chris Chelios, 37. That worked out. Alf Samuelson, 35. Todd Gill, 34. Yuri Slager, 30. Matthew Schneider, 33. Corey Cross, 35. Brad Stewart, who was 28 at the time of the trade, but had already played almost 600 games in the league and a deep veteran. Marek Zidlicki, 38. That's Duncan Keith's age now. Mike Green, 34. Dmitry Kulikov, 30. He loves veteran defensemen. And there's lots of reasons he's going to love Duncan Keith.
Yeah.
But does he overvalue him?
Does he overvalue him, or does everybody else undervalue them? I mean, has this worked out? Has the strategy worked out? I guess it works out sometimes and not other times.
It worked out with Chelios eventually, even though it was 3 years after the deadline trade before they actually won a cup. Chelios he beat quite a few odds. It worked out with Brad Stewart. They won the cup the year they got Brad Stewart, 28 years old, not 38 years old. And they otherwise, I mean,
Rafalski, didn't get him.
Mike Green, yeah, where's Rafalski? They signed him as a free agent, maybe?
Yeah.
Because he's not on my trade. This guy that Holland traded for.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, you're right. Because Rafalski certainly was a great pickup by Detroit as a must have been as a free agent. So I went through the trade list with a fine-tooth comb. Look at all these old defensemen. My goodness.
So here's the reaction in Edmonton. I did a poll, Bruce. 2,400 votes, so that's a lot of people voting.
Oh,
Should the Oilers try to trade for Duncan Keith? So this isn't even
for
anything. It's
what?
just
How
try to
much?
trade for him. It doesn't say for what or how much. Yes, 29%. No, 71%. Now, strangely, Bruce, this might work to the Oilers' advantage. Like, let's say Ken Holland does have a tendency to overvalue these players, but so
Hmm.
let's say this one theory is Chicago leaks this rumor. They want to put the, it comes out of Chicago that there was heat being put on the Oilers to make a deal. Ken
Hmm.
Holland's working away, and he's thinking, oh well, we'll trade Kyle Turris for this guy, and that'll be the
Okay,
deal.
so
But then there's this massive negative reaction in Edmonton, so which might give him pause, but it also takes the pressure off him. Like he now has, if he doesn't proceed here, it's not in politically at least, and that
hmm,
matters, right?
it does.
It matters politically. There's no heat on him. He does what the vast majority, and many people feel fiercely strongly about this, that they shouldn't make this
Mm.
deal. So I think this is actually in Ken Holland's. It helps them to take it, might give a pause to see this fan reaction and reevaluate things. Like, and it seemed like, so from reading or from hearing Bob, like, Stauffer was making it clear, like, the Oilers aren't going to be trading James Neal's contract
Right.
for this player, and it's going to be much less than he was skeptical of at first yesterday about whether they were going to have to, Chicago was going to have to retain salary or not. And Friedman said that was being negotiated right now. So
I would
listen,
certainly hope so.
I hope there's a pause here. Again, I'm not sure of his value, but there are some red flags. It would be surprising if his value is more than $3 million a year right now. To me, that would be surprising. And that would
Mhm.
be to me, the upper end. So it looks like Chicago should probably, like, if there was a trade tomorrow and Chicago was retaining half the contract, I'd be okay with that. I don't know enough about the player to be sure, but that sounds within the ballpark. If Chicago was even to retain 40%, I'd probably be okay with it. Like, I'm an Oiler fan, so I want the Oilers to gouge every team as much as possible on every deal. But I would think that's within the realm of reasonable. They have more information than I do. I'm not inclined at this point to give them the benefit of the doubt, but in terms of player acquisitions, but I try to cool my jets on that as well, and to be patient. So if it was like that, but if they trade him for Kyle Turris and 10% retained, or even 25% retained, I don't think that's a good deal
Oh,
on the face of it. And I hope that they grind Chicago and they say, do it. Yeah. Okay, we're out. Do it. Yeah. If you want to come back to us, our
mhm.
offer is we'll take them. You retain half. That's our bottom
If
line.
you send us Dylan Strome.
Yeah. Dylan Strome, interestingly, Bruce, didn't have a very good scoring year last year either. His points
Oh,
per
more.
60 at even strength was abysmal. It was down in, he's fourth line production level of even strength production. So he earns 3 million. So the
Okay.
price for Dylan Strome should not be high. For the amount of money he made, he did not have league average scoring at even strength
Hmm.
last year. He's been coming. He had a good year first year in Chicago, and he's been coming down ever since then. His
Yeah.
value should be low, but everyone's excited about him because he's Connor McDavid's friend, and
Hmm.
from Erie, and he has scored well in the past. He's still 24 years old, 25 years old, whatever he is. So yeah, maybe that's the deal, Bruce. You take on Strome, like you clear out the cap space for them on a player who didn't provide good value for them last year, and you take on Duncan Keith at half price.
Hmm.
And do you give up Caleb Jones? Now this is the rub for a lot of people.
Yeah. Well,
It's a bit of a rub for me. Like Jonathan Willis was talking about how players, lots of people have talked about this. Players, their careers don't advance steadily. Sometimes they take a step back. That's what I saw with Caleb Jones myself last year, was a definite step back, but doesn't mean he can't rebound. I thought he has the potential to be a top 4 D-man in the NHL. That's where he was trending. That's what I saw. I don't think that that's out the window at this point. There's people who are
hmm.
less excited about Jones than me, uh,
Yep.
but if it was Dylan Strome and Duncan Keith for Caleb Jones and half retention on Keith, I wouldn't scream if that deal was made, Bruce. I would wonder about it, but I would I wouldn't scream about it. What about you?
Well, that would open up a lot of cap space for Chicago. And the rumor is that Chicago wants to go after Seth Jones and that they need cap space to do that first and foremost. But having his brother on the team wouldn't hurt them either. But this idea that Chicago's going to, dump contracts onto Edmonton and get Caleb Jones and, oh, yeah, a couple of draft picks maybe. I mean, some people are dreaming in Technicolor about what the value is of Duncan Keith. I
Duncan
mean, why
Keith.
would Edmonton do that for Chicago? Let's make cap space so Chicago can sign Seth Jones. Sure, that sounds like a plan.
Do you think Chicago should throw on it? Like if they were to trade for Caleb Jones, should Chicago throw on a pick or two? Because listen, Dylan Strome to me is a bit of a salary dump. Like he's a coin flip whether he's going to earn $3 million next year, be of that value. He didn't last year based on his scoring. I mean, he's a forward. He's there to score. He didn't score at even strength. And now he might, I'm hoping the Nugent Hopkins will bounce back. I'm hoping, if the Oilers got Dylan Strome, might think the same thing. And he's more of a one-shot shooter than the Oilers. He is that. That's my memory of Dylan Strome. He can shoot that puck. So he might be a good fit with Connor McDavid on that top line. That's a real possibility. So, but would you think they'd have to get a pick as well? Chicago would have to give up a pick?
Well, yeah, I'm looking at more. Chicago should be throwing a pick Edmonton's way if Edmonton's taking that contract off their hands. And Chicago has this year first rounder, 2 in the second round, none in the third round, 2 in the fourth round. And of course, Edmonton's got a pick in the first round. And then on Saturday, I think their first pick is scheduled for 5 o'clock in the afternoon. It's just like this big long drought on Saturday. They got hardly any picks. I think they have 1 pick. 2 picks in the first 5 rounds, so 2 out of the first 160. So Edmonton clearly is in the market to add a draft pick or 2 and every right to ask for one in any kind of deal involving taking a salary off of any other team. I mean, it's up to me. If I want to trade for a $5 million player off another team, sure, I'm good with that. But the player I want is Yanni Gourde.
Yeah.
Because Tampa's got to get rid of salary to make space for, next year, presumably Kucherov will actually be back in the living persons list during the regular season, and they'll have to make room for him. So they're going to have to move on from a player or two. Maybe it's Alex Killorn. Hey, great, I'll take Alex Killorn, pay him full price, no problem. Duncan Keith, 38 years old, still being paid like he was 28 years old? No.
That's it, right? Like they gave him that contract. These are the years they were just going to have to eat the contract, and exactly. This long-term deal worked out super well for them.
Absolutely.
Listen, I'm really on. There are enough red flags. Age and point production being the main ones for me. Like you got to grind this. You have got to hold. Yeah. You're going to have to say no to Chicago and have them come back to you. You're going to have to refuse them. This is one where you say no and you back away. Circle back to me, Chicago, when you can't move them to Seattle. Right. It should be the Oilers' stance at this point, just to get the deal down, to get full advantage. Because I think Chicago might have to move this player, and I don't know that. I'm just guessing. But a player of this stature makes it clear he wants out. I think you get him out, and if they can get him out, retaining half retention, that's a small price to pay for what they got out of Duncan Keith all those years, and they should be happy that that's it. That's as little as the penalty is at this point. So I'm not. Yeah, I'm in the grind them camp on this deal.
Yeah, well, they started paying him in 2010, Keith, and this was after he'd already had a couple of big scoring seasons, 69 points in his platform season, and a cup. So they're paying him off of that, and that's why they wanted to go long term, was to lower the cap hit, because they would have had to pay him $7.5 or $8 million cap hit for a 6 or 7 year contract. Right? Yeah, but before the NHL cracked down on the long term contracts. And since then, he had 45, this is points, 45, 40, 27 during the lockout year, which equates to close to 50, 61, 45, 43, 53, 32, 40. That's up to 2 years ago. Then last year he fell off to 27, this year to 15. And granted, both those seasons are a little bit short, but not that short that the scoring should plummet to such a degree as that, right? Like he went from scoring a point every second game to now he's getting one every third or fourth game.
Yeah. He's a third line puck mover at this point. He's nothing special. He just isn't. And he was on their top power play unit and he didn't perform there. So that's not in Duncan Keith's repertoire anymore.
And last year he played 23, 25 a game. Like he is a huge workhorse minute muncher. He's a fantastic fitness freak, apparently. Like he's never played in his entire career from 2005 to 21, which is 16 years in the NHL. He's never played less than 23 minutes a night from a rookie right on through. Like he's always been that guy. But, the peak was a long time ago. So he's, I love the player, what he was. I just don't see the value remaining in the, like they got the maximum use out of that contract. To dump it at this point, if they don't have to include a sweetener, it's a huge win for Chicago.
Yeah, I hear you. So we're kind of on the same page. Grind it out. I'm a little. I think if they get him, it might work out. Like I'm always hopeful about that.
Put
And
him
I
with
don't
Evan
know.
Bouchard.
Yeah, the thing is, it's Adam. Like I don't know. Like unless you're going to put out Larson and Nurse, which I think they should try as their top pairing. If Larson comes back, which is now, it's interesting. Like the second the Larson contracts, you start to hear iffy things about it. Then you start to hear, oh, Tyson Barrie might come back. Like it's interesting how they're kind of maybe playing them a little bit against each other. I'm not exactly sure if that's going on, but I'm in the camp that would much rather see Adam Larson come back on a 4-year deal than Tyson Barrie on a 4-year deal. And that has been that thought has grown during the playoffs. I mean, we do see defensemen like Adam Larson doing well in the playoffs, as long as they don't change the rules again, which they might. But if they keep these rules, you're going to need guys like Adam Larson, definitely. Now, if they open things wide open, then you might be looking at Tyson Barrie as the better bet. But what are the chances that's going to happen? Bruce, England is soon to play against Ukraine.
Yeah.
So that's short, man.
I think the game is actually already underway. So
let's get watching.
A little bit of catching up to do. But
do you have any final thoughts?
Handle with extreme care, and I think this is a major litmus test of Ken Holland. Frankly, that he's got to negotiate hard with Stan Bowman, and he's got to come up with a deal for Edmonton that's more than a 38-year-old defenseman with a big salary. Even if some of it's bought down, he needs to get more than that.
Would you be okay if they retain half? Would that be enough for you? Let's say Chicago retains half, the Oilers get Duncan Keith for
a 7th rounder in 2029?
No, like a minor league player they no longer want. Like the Oilers no longer.
Same
McPhee.
difference.
They signed Grant McPhee. Like I don't know, like someone on their 50-man list that they don't want. Let's say it's Cooper Marody. They don't seem to want him anymore for some reason. Anyway, let's not deal with. Let's just someone they don't want on their 50-man roster that they've written off already, and Chicago retains half. Thumbs up or thumbs down from Bruce McCurdy?
Half retained.
Half retained.
I like the player. I don't think I still like the contract. 2.7. That's rich, but I mean, he did play 23 minutes a night, but he also played on a team that wasn't very successful. So,
thumbs down then.
Yes.
Thumbs down. If they did that, I would. It would seem at least it would seem reasonable. Like it's within the realm of reasonable. And as much as I know about the player, it's hard for me to give any opinion because of that. Like honestly, thumbs up or thumbs down. If I had a better take on Keith, I could say. So I like to have like thumbs up or thumbs down myself. I'm not prepared to do that unless I saw this player. That's my position on all these trades. I'm not going to weigh in on players I don't know enough about. Right. I've been there, done that, got the Jamie Alexiak t-shirt. I'm through with that, Bruce. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, we all know it's not like we haven't seen Duncan Keith. We all know how great he was 6 or 8 years ago, but you need current information. This is where the Oilers and their pro scouts and their analysts and their video watchers and that have got to be all on top of it, right? can't be Griffin Reinhart. Well, we liked him when he was in junior, and oh yeah, nobody watched him play last year in the AHL kind of deal. You got to say, no, we watched him right up to his most recent game, and we still think he's got game. And here's, you got to make a strong case. Well, he's Duncan Keith, and he's got 3 Stanley Cup rings. Last one of those was 6 years ago, man.
Yeah, and Griffin Reinhart was a different group of people. If they had watched Griffin Reinhart in the AHL that season, I wonder what they would have seen, Bruce. He was with a group of, let me just see here.
Adam Pelech, Ryan Pulock, Scott Mayfield, Griffin Reinhart were all on that team. And the first 3 I named are all current, regular, full-time New York Islanders, very successful. And Griffin Reinhart is in Europe, somewhere in Europe.
Yeah, they had a 20-year-old Adam Pelech, a 19-year-old Ryan Pulock, and a 20-year-old Griffin Reinhart. And if they had seen, and they had a 21-year-old Scott Mayfield,
right,
who played 69 games, if they had someone watched, done the proper due diligence watching that team, they might have thought, hey, Ryan Pulock is actually
that trade, yeah.
Yeah, or Adam Pelech. I see something in that Pelech kid. And they might have held off on Griffin Reinhart. And it does sound like they were just... Anyway.
Anyway, Griffin Reinhart played the most recent season with the Iserlohn Roosters of the Deutsche Elite League, I think, the DEL. Iserlohn Roosters. So, didn't end well.
Alrighty. Bruce, thanks for talking today.
Yeah, all right. Thanks for listening, everyone.
And in the meantime, and in between times, this has been another edition of the Cult of Hockey podcast.